The Wehrmacht, 18 million men under arms, commanded by Adolf Hitler. This army will march into Europe and wage the bloodiest war in history. What sort of an army was it? Obedient followers of Hitler, or millions of manipulated young men? Young men trained and sent to the front. 1 in 3 will perish. Hitler's officers and generals, status-conscious military professionals, most of them non-political. Some of them were thoughtful men. Many were spineless careerists. Did they all share Hitler's goals? What part did they play in the crimes committed in the name of the German people? Ordinary soldiers who put their lives on the line, privates, non-commissioned officers. What did they feel? What did they believe in when they went to war?
Jeder hat gesagt, Menschenskind, da möchte auch dabei sein. Jeder wollte so ein kleiner Held sein.
Heute sieht man das ein bisschen kritischer, den Beruf eines Soldaten. Aber damals war man froh, dass man irgendwo als junger Mann unterkommt.
Automatisch habe ich geschossen auf ihn und musste gleich bei diesem ersten Einsatz schon erleben, dass ich einen Menschen getötet hatte. Das verfolgt mich bis heute.
Die Gedanken haben uns nicht gemacht. Wir waren ja auch ein Haufen, der ziemlich zusammenhielt.
Wir haben neben unserem toten Kameraden unser Brot gegessen, nicht? Oder das Korische aufgelöffelt, nicht? Und haben einfach nur immer gehofft, dass wir eben durchkommen.
Das Gefühl, dass ich mein Gewissen habe vertaufen müssen gegen die Verpflichtung zum Gehorsam. Heute würde ich sagen Kadavergehorsam.
Ein Stück Leben wurde uns gestohlen. Anders kann ich das nicht sagen.
At first, the Wehrmacht seems invincible. German soldiers are victorious in almost every battle. Battles that cause the deaths of millions, first of the enemy, then increasingly Germans too. What made this army so destructive? In military terms, Hitler was an amateur, yet he made himself commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In a series of ruthless power struggles, he gained absolute authority, and he made the Wehrmacht his tool. Recent research has uncovered new sources that give us a clearer picture of Hitler's Wehrmacht than ever before. The files give new answers to old questions. They illustrate how little separated good and evil. They reveal in a horrific way how people were abused and manipulated. And they show how many refused to heed their conscience. Newly discovered records offer a unique glimpse into the world of the German military elite. British Secret Service files. They were discovered and evaluated by historian Sönke Neitzel. Until recently, these documents were still top secret. Tens of thousands of pages on which secretly recorded conversations are transcribed. The conversations of leading generals of the Wehrmacht. This is where it happened. The idyllic country estate of Trent Park near London. This is where all the German generals who fell into the hands of the Western Allies were held.
Die deutschen Generäle sind gefangen genommen worden unter zum Teil dramatischen Umständen und kamen dann auf diesen traumhaft gelegenen Herrensitz, wo sie in einer Friedensruhe mit allen Annehmlichkeiten des Lebens versorgt waren und dort saßen, zum Nichtstun verdammt waren. Und dieses Nichtstun hat seine Folgen gehabt, nämlich dass die Leute gesprochen haben, sie haben miteinander geredet, sie haben sich ausgetauscht über den Krieg, über Kriegsverbrechen, über Politik und über Zukunft. Und das Besondere an der Situation ist, dass die Briten diese Gespräche aufgezeichnet haben auf Platten. Und der besondere Wert der Quelle ist natürlich, dass es private Gespräche sind. Und dass in diesen Gesprächen keine Rücksicht genommen wurde auf Vorgesetzte, auf die Familie, auf die Frau. In diesen Gesprächen von Kamerad zu Kamerad wurde ungeschminkt gesprochen. Wir kommen also ganz nah ran an die Generäle, was sie gedacht haben, wie sie reflektiert haben.
Without realizing it, the captured generals gave away their real opinions about the war and the Nazis.
World history will concede one point to the Führer, that he recognized this great Jewish danger for the whole of mankind. Once it was Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun. This time it's Jewish Bolshevism. We in our tiny West European countries have been so short-sighted. We were always bickering with each other over petty issues. We simply failed to understand what was threatening us from the East. In this, the Führer was absolute.
But what he did was stupid.
We were the stupid ones. The countries of Western Europe refused to join us, those idiots, and we suddenly found ourselves fighting on two fronts.
And doing the dirty work for the Western world.
Few Wehrmacht soldiers are completely free of anti-Semitism and nationalism. They're children of their times. They don't realize they're witnessing the beginning of the greatest disaster the world has ever seen. They even regard Hitler as a man of peace.
Hitler hat ja immer wieder gesagt, er kenne den Ersten Weltkrieg, sei schwer verwundet, zurückgekommen und so weiter. Also waren alle davon überzeugt, dass er keinen Krieg anfangen würde. Und das muss ich auch noch sagen, im Polenfeldzug haben wir angenommen, dass die Polen in ihrem Größenwahnsinn die Kriegsschuld hätten.
That's what Heinrich Husmann has learned from the propaganda. He's with the 5th Panzer Division based in Upper Silesia in the summer of 1939. On September the 1st, the tanks crossed the border into Poland. It's the start of World War II. The older soldiers have mixed feelings, but the young are consumed by Hitler's ideas. Walter Heinlein is 20 years old.
Ich war begeistert. Ich wollte ja Soldat werden. Allerdings, wie es dann später wird, das konnten wir nicht ahnen. Jedenfalls, ich war begeistert. Gott sei Dank, jetzt geht's los. Hoffentlich komme ich noch zurecht, dass es schon zu spät ist.
On this first day of the war, Adolf Hitler addresses a jubilant German parliament. He makes a blatant threat.
So wie ich selber bereit bin, jederzeit mein Leben einzusetzen. Jeder kann es mir nehmen für mein Volk und für Deutschland. So verlange ich dasselbe auch von jedem anderen. Wer aber glaubt, sich diesem nationalen Gebot, sei es direkt oder indirekt, widersetzen zu können, der fällt. Verräter haben nichts erwartet als der Tod. Wir alle bekennen uns damit nur zu unserem alten Grundsatz. Es ist gänzlich unwichtig, ob wir leben. Aber notwendig ist es, dass unser Volk lebt. Das deutsche Leben.
The soldiers are not prepared for the horrors of war. The Wehrmacht is far superior to the defending Polish forces. Even so, the ugly reality comes as a shock. But the men can't give vent to their feelings.
Am 2. September hatten wir dann die ersten, zwei Toten in unserer Kompanie beim Angriff auf Pless. Da hatten die Polen eine Bunkerlinie und die sollten wir als Fußsoldaten, ich hätte fast gesagt, mit bloßer Brust nehmen, und das gelang uns nicht.
Approximately 1.8 million Wehrmacht soldiers have been mobilized. They're going to war under the command of the generals. Men like Infantry General Johannes Blaskowitz, the son of a pastor from East Prussia. His mother died when he was still a baby. He was raised in military academies, the elite establishments of the Prussian aristocracy. Here he's trained for the life of an officer, the toughest education in the entire Reich. In exchange, a penniless young man gains entry to a privileged world. A uniform makes you something superior. Officers are treated with the highest respect. They receive the best service in restaurants, and the best tickets are reserved for them at the theater. In World War I, a formative experience for most Wehrmacht generals, Blaskowitz makes rapid progress. At 33, he's appointed to staff headquarters. But then comes the defeat of 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles, a humiliating blow. The German army is cut to 100,000 men. The generals want only one thing: the return of their former power. Johannes Blaskowitz, now a colonel, is accepted into the new army, but he's given administrative duties. For the time being, there's no hope of career advancement. Unknown to him, the military office in Berlin, an undercover general staff, is already planning rearmament. Karl Dirks, himself a World War II veteran, has written a book arguing that the army leadership wanted massive rearmament.
Diese Wiederaufrüstung war seit 1923 im Schatten der Ruhrbesetzung geplant. Damals konnte man unter dem Vorzeichen patriotische Aufgabe die Wiederbewaffnung planen. Außerdem war von Seeckt mithilfe des Notstandsparagraphen 48 die vollziehende Gewalt übertragen. Er brauchte jetzt niemanden mehr fragen, ob er das planen durfte oder nicht.
Hans von Seeckt, head of the army, is the driving force behind rearmament. It must be kept secret, for the planning alone is a violation of the peace treaty. In reality, Seeckt is planning for war.
Was will der Generalstab im Krisenfall zur Verfügung haben? Dazu werden die nötigen Divisionen und ihre Ausrüstung geplant. Und dann wird das im Detail verfeinert, sodass man auf Knopfdruck zur Durchführung übergehen kann. Das war der Zweck dieses Planes, also eigentlich eine Grundlage für die notwendigen Beschaffungen, die notwendigen Gelder, das notwendige Personal. Man kam auf insgesamt einen Bedarf von 3,75 Millionen Köpfen.
When Hitler comes to power in 1933, plans for the deployment of the Wehrmacht are ready. Karl Dirks has shown that the Wehrmacht of 102 divisions, with which Hitler begins World War II, corresponds exactly to the blueprint of the generals. Everything is ready for Hitler. Rearmament now moves ahead at top speed. The effects can be felt in everyday life.
Mit einmal ging alles in Uniform. Innerhalb von 8 Monaten war alles. Also da waren Leute, Beamte, die bei der Behörde beschäftigt waren und waren Zivilbeamte. Und bei uns am Dommernsweg wohnte auch einer, der grüßte immer zu uns rauf. Wir wohnten damals in der 3. Etage in der Fruchtallee. Und jedes Mal, wenn wir am Fenster saßen, nahm er seinen Hut und grüßte. Und 4 Wochen später, da kam er in Uniform mit Säbel. Und da machte er so. Und da habe ich, guck an, Herr Sohn, ich will den Namen nicht nennen, der ist schon in Uniform. Da sagte mein Vater, jetzt wird auch der Briefträger bald ein Schwert haben.
Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid. Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid.
Dass ich dem Führer des deutschen Volkes und Reiches, Adolf Hitler, jederzeit bereit sein will,
für diesen Eid mein Leben einzusetzen.
Jederzeit für diesen Eid mein Leben einzusetzen.
Das ging mir zu Herzen, das war meine feste Überzeugung.
From 1934 on, millions of manipulated young men had to swear allegiance directly to Hitler, a man who is planning a war of conquest. The idea came from the Wehrmacht leadership itself. Some of the generals hope that by this overt act of loyalty, they will preserve the military's independence. They're wrong. The Minister of War, Werner von Blomberg, is the first to suffer the consequences. In 1938, Blomberg is dismissed for marrying a former prostitute. Hitler himself was best man at the wedding. He feels he's been deceived. He exploits the situation for his next move. There's only one man he can trust to take charge of the Wehrmacht: himself. General Wilhelm Keitel, in charge of the newly created OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, reports directly to Hitler. Franz Halder becomes Chief of Staff of the Army High Command. The two organizations become permanent rivals, ideal conditions for Hitler's intrigues. Panzer General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma knows the Army High Command well. In November 1942, he's captured by General Montgomery in North Africa and greeted with a handshake. The British are experts in dealing with high-ranking prisoners. First, they question them and keep them in basic accommodation, the same treatment given to an ordinary soldier. After they've suffered these disagreeable conditions for a while, they're taken to the more salubrious surroundings of Trent Park. The idea is they'll feel comfortable here and converse freely with one another, not suspecting their every word is recorded by the microphones of the British Secret Service. It works. Thomas speaks quite openly about the Army's leadership.
I tell you, don't expect anything from the General Staff. 99% of them are completely spineless. They have always been servile. They were never commanders. They were more like assistants. Which is why most of them have no backbone. It's their upbringing, of course. You can't expect anything else.
Hitler is mistrustful of his generals too, since he hasn't got them completely under his control. But he knows how to get his way. The generals are no match for him. Colonel Karl-Heinz Frieser is a military historian in today's German army.
Im Endeffekt kam es zu einem Modus vivendi, zu einer unheiligen Allianz. Beide brauchten einander. Hitler brauchte diese reaktionäre Militärkaste, um seine Kriege zu führen. Und für die Generale war Hitler derjenige, der nicht nur neue Divisionen aufstellte, sondern damit neue Stellen, neue Dienstposten als Divisionskommandeure schuf.
Like Hitler, the generals want to win back what the Germans lost in the First World War. But Hitler wants more. He wants to enslave the Slav peoples and to create Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Poland will become the first victim.
Es gab ja nur negative Meinungen über Polen. Polnische Wirtschaft und dreckig und unmodern und hässlich. Es war alle modisch. Was unmodisch war, war polnisch. Und wenn was dreckig war, das war auch polnisch.
Polen wurde als der ganz böse Feind hingestellt. Und das sollte ungefähr so 2-3 Wochen dauern und dann sei der Krieg vorbei. In dem Glauben hat man es uns gelassen.
Old prejudice and new belligerency fanned the flames against Poland. Johannes Blaskowitz is one of the generals in charge of the invasion. A few days before the start of hostilities, he issues a command.
Soldiers of the 8th Army. From today, the 8th Army is established, the command of which has been entrusted to me by the Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht. Our duty is to execute his will with hard, fast, forceful strikes. Long live the Führer.
The Polish campaign is a war between unequal opponents. The Poles put up fierce resistance, but in the end they can only wait in vain for the help of the Allies. Just 3.5 weeks after the outbreak of war, Błaszkowicz accepts the Polish surrender on a bus in Warsaw. Hitler's plans seem to be working. He presents himself as victor to the Poles and to his own generals. This commander-in-chief can advance their careers. Soon after the victory parade, General Błaszkowicz is awarded the Knight's Cross. He becomes head of the German occupation forces in Poland with the title Commander-in-Chief of the East. He's still a loyal, hard-working general in Hitler's Wehrmacht. But he slowly begins to have misgivings. This war is different from previous ones. In the area under his command, Jews are being harassed, pressed into forced labor, abused, and even shot. The generals only talk about it behind closed doors. It's the SS, not the Wehrmacht, that are carrying out the deliberate mass murders in Poland. But the overall head of occupying forces is Błaszkowicz, a Wehrmacht general. After several months, he issues a statement. Only later is it apparent that many officers and generals have been disturbed by the events in Poland. Edwin Count von Rotkirch is a 50-year-old colonel in a cavalry regiment. He has a hobby, making amateur films with his 8mm camera. He also likes appearing in his films. Later, as a prisoner of war, he recalls a disagreeable situation. Only now does he dare to speak about it.
I was in Kutno. I went there to film. I make films, that's all I do. I knew an SS officer there quite well, and we were talking about this and that, and then he said, "Do you feel like filming an execution?" I said, "No, I find that too disgusting." He said, "Well, it doesn't make any difference. We always shoot people in the morning anyway. But if you prefer, we still have a few left. We could also shoot them in the afternoon." You can't simply imagine how these men, they've become animals.
September the 4th, 1939, Częstochow in southern Poland, the fourth day of the war. For some unexplained reason, wild shooting breaks out shortly after German infantry enter the town. 8 German soldiers are killed and 14 wounded. The Germans retaliate in the most brutal fashion. Thousands of civilians are rounded up. At least 100 people are murdered, many of them Jews. Thus, from the opening days of the war, Wehrmacht units, some under Błaszkowicz's command, have participated in atrocities. In this case, the original shooting seems to have been friendly fire. Nervous German soldiers shooting at their own comrades. It was nothing unusual for their nerves to get the better of young soldiers.
Wenn Sie da die Waffe in der Hand haben, dann zittern Ihnen die Hände. Dann weiß man gar nicht, was man überhaupt macht. Man läuft durch die Gegend und weiß gar nicht, wo man hinläuft. Das ist, wenn die Situation da ist. Dann sind Sie froh, wenn einer sagt, Mensch, leg dich auf den Arsch oder leg dich hin. Und damit man überhaupt aus der Feuerzone kommt.
Nervous soldiers and aggressive Nazi ideology. A potent mix. Private Heinrich Husmann records his experiences in his diary.
September 10th, 1939, Opatov, Jews' paradise. I believe at least 85% of the inhabitants are Jews. And that's what it looks like. A terrible stench everywhere. And the Jewish shops are worst of all. They demand outrageous prices. We wouldn't dream of giving these vermin so much money.
Anti-Semitism was not rare in the Wehrmacht, but other soldiers are much less prejudiced.
Da waren wir in einem kleinen Dorf und da kam eine junge Dame, die mag 25, 30 gewesen sein und fragte mich, ich war damals Feldwebel, glaube ich, ja, und sie fragte mich damals, sagen Sie mal, müssen wir Angst um unser Leben haben? Und ich merkte, dass das scheinbar eine Jüdin war. Ich habe zu ihr gesagt, also soweit ich weiß, brauchte sie keine Ängste haben. Ein Jahr später oder Monate später hätte ich ihr gesagt, hauen Sie bloß ab.
General von Rothkirch feels partly responsible for the atrocities he witnessed in Poland.
Just look how savage we have become ourselves. I drove through a small Polish village. They were shooting students there, just because they were students. And Polish aristocrats and landowners too. They were shooting everyone. I went to General Bockelberg and told him about it. He just said, now listen to me. It has to be done. There is no other way. The students are the most dangerous of all. They all have to go. And the aristocrats, they're always going to make trouble. And don't get yourself so horribly worked up. If we win the war, it won't matter. I said, Herr Generaloberst, that may be. But first of all, I will have to get used to these new principles.
But he didn't protest. Not so General Blaskowitz, a devout Christian. He's genuinely horrified by the systematic murders the SS task forces have been carrying out. Though he ignores the actions of his own units, he criticizes the misdeeds of the SS and the police in 2 memos to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Walter von Brauchitsch.
The Army refuses to be linked with the atrocities of the security police and refuses to work with the SS task forces, which function almost exclusively as execution units. The police have so far only spread terror among the population. To what degree the police are able to come to terms with the fact that they are forcing their own people to take part in this murderous frenzy cannot be judged from here. It is impossible to establish security and peace in this territory with violent measures alone.
Hitler is outraged and Blaskowitz is dismissed. However, only a few months later, he's given a new post in the West. The transcripts from Trent Park reveal that his fellow generals knew the background to his dismissal and did nothing.
We shot people. It started in Poland as early as '39. Apparently, the SS really cleaned up around there.
That's probably why they dismissed Blaskowitz.
Yes, of course. And the SS people were promoted instead of being shot.
Shortly after victory in Poland, Hitler reveals his next plan to the generals. He intends to attack France as soon as possible. Most of his generals believe it can't be done. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wants to talk Hitler out of it. He considers it the idea of a madman, but still he wavers. Christian Hartmann, a historian at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, has researched Halder's life and his relations with Hitler.
Halder war der große Zögerer, der Zauderer, wobei das bei Halder nicht nur eine psychische Komponente war, sondern es war auch Ausdruck eines intellektuellen Kalküls. Als Generalstäbler war eigentlich gewohnt, immer mit mehreren Optionen zu arbeiten. Und man hat ihn ja auch mal als Rückversicherer nach allen Seiten charakterisiert. Und ich denke, da kommt Halders Rolle eigentlich sehr gut zum Ausdruck. Ein Mann, der sich alle Möglichkeiten offen halten will.
The date for the war in the West is postponed again and again. Could this give Halder his chance? For weeks, according to a confidant, Halder went to see Hitler with a pistol in his pocket in order to shoot him.
Entscheidend bleibt, dass Halder den erlösenden Schuss auf Hitler eben nicht abgegeben hat. Das ist der springende Punkt. Was wir allerdings auch wissen, es gab immer wieder Zeiten großer Differenzen, nicht nur 38, 39, auch nochmal im Sommer 41 und im Sommer 42. Also es ist ein sehr ambivalentes Verhältnis, aber letzten Endes das Attentat hat nicht stattgefunden und allein das zählt.
In November 1939, Halder witnesses Hitler in a fit of rage, railing against the cowardliness and ineptitude of the generals. Halder now believes he has been betrayed and resigns himself to remaining silent. A contemporary described the Chief of Staff thus: Halder is like a balloon man, strong and brave when someone pumps him up, floppy and hollow when deflated. Meanwhile, in Koblenz, on the banks of the Rhine, in the Prince Bishop's palace now taken over by the army, a rival of Halder is planning the campaign against France. General Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff of the newly formed Army Group A. Together with Panzer General Heinz Guderian, Manstein has developed a totally new concept. He doesn't think in fixed positions like First World War strategists. His will be a mobile war, a rolling attack that never stops, spearheaded by motorized units. The idea runs counter to the thinking of all the generals of Europe. From a military standpoint, it's revolutionary, but it poses immense logistical problems. There are many myths about the French campaign. Research by military historian Karl-Heinz Frieser has traced some of them back to their roots.
Die Deutschen machen etwas ganz Verrücktes. Nach dieser Idee des Generals von Manstein griffen sie mit ihren Panzern durch das Waldgebirge der Ardennen an und überraschten dadurch vollkommen die Alliierten. Das Zweite war der erstmalige Einsatz der Panzerwaffe auf operativer Ebene, während die Alliierten, die über 4200 Panzer verfügten, ihre Panzer entlang der gesamten Front verkleckert hatten, konzentrierten die Deutschen ihre 2400 Panzer hauptsächlich in den Ardennen, brachen hier durch und dann war die große Überraschung geschafft.
The surprise attack is to come through South Belgium, where no one is expecting it. No one worries about infringing the neutrality of the Benelux countries. This is the famous sickle cut.
Die Idee Mansteins zum Sichelschnitt war so atemberaubend, klang so verrückt. Es war wieder Alpenübergang Hannibals mit Elefanten, dass man das eher der Fantasie eines Jules Verne, aber nicht dem methodisch-pedantischen Denken eines deutschen Generals zugetraut hätte. Und so gelang eben die vollkommene Überraschung.
The weak point in Manstein's plan is that the sickle cut will expose a 100-kilometer flank to the Allies. It's a huge gamble.
Der Erfinder des Manstein-Plans wurde sein allererstes Opfer. Den General von Manstein wurde abgelöst, weil man diesen Plan für abenteuerlich und für verrückt erklärte.
Army Chief of Staff Halder exiles Manstein to an unimportant post in the provinces, but Manstein still manages to present his plan to Hitler. The irony is that Hitler can't stand Manstein and doesn't grasp the full significance of his plan. Nevertheless, Manstein becomes the key creative mind for the invasion of France.
Er hat es damals natürlich als seine größte Leistung gesehen und wir zu Hause wussten, dass es von ihm stammte. Und er war natürlich entsprechend nicht gerade sehr erfreut, dass nunmehr alle anderen den Plan, einschließlich Hitler, für sich reklamierten und dass Hitler ihn als seine geniale Idee und Tat verkaufte.
Hitler wurde im Nachhinein von der NS-Propaganda als der Schöpfer des Sichelschnitts gefeiert. In Wirklichkeit aber hatte er diese Idee gar nicht richtig verstanden.
Thus concentrated, the tanks are to push through northern France all the way to the Channel, with full aerial support and virtually without stopping. There hasn't been a campaign like it in all military history. General Guderian will lead the most important tank formations.
Festen Vertrauen auf den Sieg traten wir am 9. Mai den Vormarsch zur Grenze an.
Walter Heinlein is a gunner in a panzer division under General Guderian. His upbringing has made him entirely ready for war against France.
Die Feindschaft zu Frankreich, Erzfeind, war uns immer wieder eingebläut worden. Und da haben wir gesagt, das ist eine ganz normale Geschichte, dass wir diese Gebiete wieder zurückhaben wollen. Das ist uns auch in der Schule immer gesagt worden.
Neighbors are enemies, the spirit of the times. On May the 10th, 1940, the attack in the west begins. The rapid advance units of the Wehrmacht are to push forward through the Ardennes in southern Belgium. The countryside is so hilly and the roads so narrow, they're considered to be impassable for tanks. They take the risk. More than 40,000 vehicles have been prepared for the attack. As there are no supply depots along the way, fuel and provisions for hundreds of thousands of soldiers have to be brought along and made available at specific points. An exceptional feat of organization. But the terrain in the Ardennes keeps posing new problems. It seems the critics of Manstein's plan were right. The advancing columns of tanks and following infantry repeatedly clog the narrow mountain roads. They called it the biggest tailback in history.
Wir standen mit unseren Panzern und ich war ja also bei einer praktisch Panzerinfanteriekompanie. Wir saßen auf unseren Fahrzeugen, wir konnten immer 7 Mann drauf sitzen, stundenlang und fuhren nicht weiter.
If spotted, these stationary vehicles would be an easy target for enemy air forces.
Da waren die Straßen von uns, von unseren Fahrzeugen und Panzern oft so verstopft, da hieß es auf Postkarten Stärke ranfahren, also aufschließen.
Eventually they succeed in unraveling the tailback. The Allies had not expected an attack through the Ardennes, so there are few casualties along the way. The element of surprise is crucial.
Der Vormarsch, der ging dann so schnell, da haben wir ein Schloss gefunden und da war ich beteiligt mit dran. Und da sind wir in das Schloss, da waren englische Offiziere drin. Die haben gerade gefrühstückt, und es war also, ja, uns war das schleierhaft, die waren so überrascht durch unser Vorstoß, die nie gedacht haben, dass es so schnell geht. Haben wir alle gefangen genommen. Ne?
The soldiers come to believe they're part of a modern, almost invincible army. It will turn out to be a dangerous illusion.
Das Kräfteverhältnis zwischen den westlichen Alliierten und der deutschen Wehrmacht war eindeutig zugunsten der Westmächte. Sie hatten sogar erheblich bessere Panzer. Die deutschen Ingenieure mussten einen riesigen Rückstand aufholen. Im Jahr 1940 waren fast auf der ganzen Ebene die Westmächte überlegen.
The few modern divisions the Wehrmacht possesses are deployed like the steel tip of a lance. Out of a total of 157 divisions, only 10 have tanks, and only 6 are fully motorized. Behind the tanks come the horse-drawn units, technologically unchanged since the Napoleonic Wars. The vast majority of soldiers march on foot. Most divisions are poorly equipped and insufficiently trained. only about half the army is fully battle-ready. Yet the ideas behind the army are modern, especially the system known as Mission Command.
Die deutsche Armee war berühmt dafür, dass sie den unteren Leuten Spielraum ließ für die Ausführung von Befehlen. Das heißt nicht, du greifst jetzt an, gehst mit deinen Leuten hier den Hang rauf, brichst da hinten durch den Wald durch und greifst dann die Höhe von hinten an, sondern die Kompanie greift den Feind dort an, nach örtlicher Erkundung, nicht wahr? Oberleutnant sowieso führt den Angriff. Und dann konnte er die optimale Position herausarbeiten, die hinten gar nicht wissen konnten.
Thus, every individual has his task. At the same time, the responsibility of non-commissioned officers and ordinary soldiers is increased, in the moral sense too. The question of good and evil is posed to each and every individual. A bunker near the town of Sedan in France, the next obstacle to the Wehrmacht south of the Ardennes. The valley of the Maas is like one gigantic fortress. The Germans had won an important victory here in 1870. Hitler wants the army to pause after taking Sedan. Yet in Manstein's plan, the Maas is just one point in the advance to the Channel, which is to continue without interruption. Conflicts in the Wehrmacht leadership have become inevitable. The attack on Sedan begins with a massive bombardment. The French put up desperate resistance, but the defenders are finally overwhelmed. Now Walter Heinlein finds out about the terrible side of war.
Beim Marsübergang, da haben wir gemerkt, dass also auch ein Gegner da ist. Und haben da ganz schön Zunder gekriegt. Ich habe auch die ersten Toten gehabt. Und da wird man schon etwas, da guckt man schon, was ist los. Der Krieg ist halt doch kein Spaziergang.
Heinlein's early enthusiasm soon evaporates.
Angst hat jeder. Also wer sagt, dass einer keine Angst hat, ist ein Lügner. Nicht? Immer wieder, jeden Tag bis zum Ende des Krieges. Angst ist halt der Mensch, der hat halt Angst, er reagiert so.
The battles are intense but brief. The very next day, 60,000 men and 22,000 vehicles, including 850 tanks, cross the Maas near Sedan. Then, on May the 14th, the Panzers break out of their bridgehead. Without waiting, they strike out towards the west, towards the Channel. General Guderian's tank corps is advancing against the express orders of his superiors and Hitler. According to Hitler's supposedly brilliant plan, the Blitzkrieg was to have stopped here. Through his own initiative, Guderian saves the campaign.
Uns hat halt überrascht der schnelle Vorstoß, nicht? Und das war ja Guderian, der das eigentlich uns vorgelebt hat. Und also nichts wie durch, ohne Rücksicht, was rechts und links ist, sondern durch.
Guderian gets his way, and his tactics seem to succeed. A mid-level general of the Wehrmacht has shown up the commander-in-chief. It's very embarrassing for Hitler. 10 days later, the Wehrmacht is almost at the Channel. Manstein's plan calls for an encirclement of the Allied armies in Belgium, preventing their retreat through the port of Dunkirk. But then something extraordinary happens. Hitler orders the attack to halt. For 3 days, the panzers don't move. The generals feel like hunting dogs held back in the heat of the hunt. They watch their prey escaping. The order to stop before Dunkirk was a critical mistake. Many people still scratch their heads about it today. Did Hitler intentionally let the British escape across the Channel? The soldiers can't believe it.
Na, wir haben gedacht, ja, warum geht's nicht weiter? Wir haben doch alle Mittel da, wir haben unsere Panzer da, wir können doch die Engländer alle ins Wasser schmeißen, nicht? Und durften nicht. Und dann kam die Luftwaffe, die hat dann natürlich bombardiert und auf die Schiffe, viele haben sie natürlich nicht getroffen. Es ging halt damals auch noch nicht alles so gut. Und da sind also dann leider viele von dem englischen Korps übers Wasser entkommen. Ne?
From Dunkirk, the bulk of the Allied armies are evacuated across the Channel. 340,000 men. Only vehicles and heavy equipment are left behind.
Hinterher erfahre ich, dass es einen Führerbefehl gegeben hat, dass nicht auf die fliehenden Engländer geschossen werden durfte. Das sogenannte Expeditionsheer sollte die Schiffe erreichen. Da haben wir noch gesagt, was ein Blödsinn. Und da hat unser Kommandeur gesagt, na ja, die Engländer, das sind Wikinger. Das ist eine germanische Rasse. War doch damals die Rassenwahnsinn, der war doch da weit verbreitet. Ne?
There was no such order. The real reasons were different. To ensure the rapid success of the operation, the Army High Command had taken important decisions without consulting the Commander-in-Chief. Once again, Hitler felt ignored.
Hitler wollte bei Dünkirchen gar nicht die Panzer stoppen, sondern die Generale. Bei Dünkirchen kam es zum allerersten und auch zum letzten Mal zu einem Aufstand des Oberkommandos des Heeres gegen Hitler, zu einer Art Machtkampf, einer Machtprobe. Und Hitler gewann sie. Es war quasi ein Aufstand gegen ihn als militärischen Führer. Und nun statuierte er eben dieses Exempel und befahl aus Prinzip, dass die Panzer halten müssten.
Hitler's ploy works. The generals have lost a crucial showdown. For him, that's more important than 340,000 of the enemy escaping. A short time later, France surrenders, and Hitler can once again play the role of brilliant victor, commander of genius. A large part of France is occupied by the Wehrmacht. In their euphoria, the soldiers are ignorant of the power struggle going on behind closed doors. Their feelings of invincibility seem fully justified. The few critical voices in the army are silenced. Victory comes at a high cost. 25,000 German and over 100,000 Allied soldiers have lost their lives. Thousands of civilians have been killed.
Wenn man von Anfang an eigentlich dabei war und man überlebt, dann ist es doch ein ganz seltenes Glück, das er hat. Nicht? Und die jungen Leute, die dann sterben mussten, für wen und für was? Für wen sind die dann gefallen? Das heißt immer fürs Vaterland, ja. Aber für wen? Ne?
An important shift has taken place in the power structure of the Reich. Now more than ever before, the Wehrmacht is at the mercy of the dictator's whim. The military leadership has become a passive tool in Hitler's hands. At Trent Park, the captured German generals wonder how it could have come to this.
No matter how hard I try, I just can't get into my head what it was that made us follow that maniac Hitler.
And how did it begin? The officers were so unpolitical and they believed that the government was just as honest as they were. If it had been a democratic government, we never would have believed them. It was the national spirit. He wrapped himself in the cloak of national spirit and he deceived us.
From a negative, from a criminal point of view, the Nazis did what they did extremely well, and so logically.
The clique around him, they are to blame. They all should have said to him, my Führer, and now it's...
Perhaps you wouldn't let them say anything.
Then they should have resigned.
But no one did. Franz Halder stayed at his post until 1942. Then, following arguments with Hitler, he was dismissed. After the assassination attempt on the 20th of July 1944, he was arrested. Halder lived until 1972. At the end of the war, Heinrich Husmann is a sergeant major. The terrible things he's seen help him to get over his belief in Hitler's ideology. Today, he's a deeply religious man. Johannes Blaskowitz is appointed to various senior posts and is highly decorated. In 1948, he takes his own life while on trial at the Nuremberg Military Tribunal. The reasons for his suicide are not known. Walter Heinlein was wounded 6 times. He was decorated and reached the rank of captain. After the war, he became a carpenter, later an architect and building contractor. Today, he still gives lectures about his war experiences. Erich von Manstein was further promoted, but in 1944, Hitler dismissed him. He refused to take part in resistance efforts. After the war, he became a consultant for the formation of the new German army. He died in 1973. Georg Pendel saw out the war in his Luftwaffe ground unit. At the end, he felt betrayed, but wiser. After the war, he became a policeman. Most of the Wehrmacht soldiers kept their enthusiasm for the commander-in-chief for a long time. But Hitler's Blitzkrieg, as represented by Nazi propaganda, was a myth.
Hitler war nie populärer als nach dem Westfeldzug. Er wurde als eine Art neuer Messias angesehen, der ein Wunder geschaffen habe, das Wunder von 1940. Dies schrieb man damals dem Genie Hitlers zu, ohne zu wissen, welche Vorgänge es tatsächlich hinter den Kulissen gab.
In 1940, Hitler, his army, and many ordinary Germans are intoxicated by the victory in the West. The prestige of the Nazis is at its highest point. Hitler need no longer fear opposition from the army. The consequences of that will be seen the following year in the East, with the war against the Soviet Union.